The timing of the Alaska meeting was wedged between U.S. Secretary of State Blinken's trip to Japan and South Korea and Secretary of Defense Austin's trip to India. Days before the meeting, Biden also emphasized his Indo-Pacific strategy when he held a virtual meeting with the leaders of Japan, India, and Australia. This confirms Biden's effort to rebuild alliances and court new ones. I speak to Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University, to find out how China will respond to the U.S. overtures in China's neighborhood, particularly on the security issue. For more on that, Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy with Tsinghua University. Senior Colonel Zhou, what a pleasure. One of the most important things both sides have been talking about is to avoid conflicts and confrontation. Now, how much do you think the Anchorage meeting will pave a foundation for that?
Very few consensus between the two sides. One of them is to avoid confrontation. So we have to go through risk reduction for our joint good purposes. And of course, where first of all lies the danger. The danger is in our space, the danger is in South China Sea, and with the ever-rising competition between us, we have to avoid a miscalculation elsewhere as well.
Well, to say that is very easy, but to do it, Senior Colonel Zhou, with your decades of experience on security issue, is extremely difficult, particularly given the geopolitics right now between China and the U.S. Now, do you see the top diplomats during their meeting and the readouts later of their achievement managed to touch on anything specific?
Well, I think it is exceptional in many ways. Actually, I believe that Director Yang is normally a mild person, but it's the first time that I actually have seen him giving vent to a pent-up anger. So this is unusual, but that, of course, has a reason behind it, as he has laid out. So this is exceptional, and I wonder whether this would be a watershed in a bilateral relationship, but at least it gives people an impression that this is really a talk between two equals. And Americans have made it clear that this is a relationship characterized with competition. My wish is cooperation would still prevail over competition. But right now, it doesn't look like this. It seems that the competition has already prevailed over cooperation. So in this case, what we need to do is to make the competition more or less manageable, even if it is stiff.
Well, we are talking. The Russian foreign minister is visiting China. Well, at the same time, the U.S. Secretary of State is going to Brussels for the NATO meeting and also meet with the EU leaders. Now, it seems that this is a very interesting strategic grouping, apparently, that has been coming into form. Senior Colonel Zhou, is that also your take?
What I would say is definitely the Biden administration would enhance its alliance relationship, which was somehow damaged by President Trump, actually to a great degree. And China's relationship with Russia is, of course, a very close one. The only question is, would it develop into a relationship of alliance or not? Because that, if China and Russia come into alliance, that would be the nightmare of the Western countries. And I would consider that probably is really an indicator of another new Cold War. But so far, neither China nor Russia has expressed its willingness to come into military alliance. There is a kind of a relationship. If you compare these two relationships, one is the alliance led by the United States, and the ever-close relationship between China and Russia. The point is, if the U.S. have more pressure on China and Russia, definitely these two countries, taken as top competitors of the United States, will get ever closer.
Very interesting. On the other hand, this is the top diplomats meeting. So when many would wonder, going to be the meetings between the two militaries at the top level. We saw the American Defense Secretary quite busy, in fact, over the past few weeks, visiting one ally and then another country, trying to show some message.
So in terms of military relationship, generally speaking, we still have maintained a working relationship, although it's not a kind of meeting at the top. But I've also taken notice that the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Austin, called China a pacing threat, while Russia is a direct adversary. So that means China is becoming a competitor that is getting increasingly closer to the United States. He also said that he would take a kind of a laser focus on China. That is fine. But as I mentioned before, the largest challenge for the two sides is to avoid confrontation. And for that, we really need to sit down and talk about details. I was notified that actually this is already found in press that in last October, Chinese and the U.S. military had the first crisis management working group meeting. So this is significant in that never before have we mentioned the crisis as such. Normally we mention the accidents or incidents. So by mentioning crisis, it indicates that both sides have a kind of a sense of urgency. So that means we really could have crises between us. So how could we diffuse them? So I think the first effort is to look square into the question, to admit that we might really have crisis. So if we discuss about all the different scenarios of crisis which nobody wants to see, maybe this can help us to diffuse the crisis in the first place.
On the Taiwan issue, which is one of those areas that's very likely to lead to crisis, Senior Colonel Zhou, according to the readout from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the United States committed to the one China policy. So to you, is that enough? What is going on right now across the Taiwan Straits and in the South China Sea, actually to many, are very worrisome?
Well, I think previously people really talk more about South China Sea, and nowadays people seem to talk about Taiwan in a different tone. I'm most happy to read that the U.S. representative this time have a pledge to honor a one China policy again, because there have been a debate going on in the United States, especially among academics, as to whether they should uphold this principle or not. For example, I actually have realized that there was a debate between Richard Haas and Bonnie Glaser on whether they should, whether the U.S. government should policy or not. Richard Haas has actually suggested the American government to relinquish this decade-old policy, but Bonnie Glaser insists that the American government still stick to this policy. But I'm happy to see that at least the American government officials have reiterated this one China policy and have expressed that they have not changed this policy. Because this is really, really important. It is really the red line for China.
Yeah, but saying it's one thing, doing it's another thing, isn't it? With the situation seems to be quite intense, at least on the sea right now. Senior Colonel Zhou, how big a danger is there that we're running into a possible conflict?
Well, I think most probably the American Navy would still carry on its freedom of navigation operations in the waters of Chinese island and rocks. But the tempo and the frequency is another issue, because I don't believe it is a really big issue on the agenda of Biden administration, because he would be so preoccupied with many other things. And even diplomacy itself would not be a big issue on his table. So if we come to concrete issues such as South China Sea, probably he maintain the status quo, and China would look at Americans' behavior as a provocation to China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So the point is, even according to Americans' myriad of reports, the U.S. military doesn't necessarily have an age of the Chinese military in the West Pacific. According to CNN's latest report, the Chinese Navy even has more ships than the U.S. Navy. Well, at least in terms of, this is quantitatively speaking, not qualitatively speaking. Mm-hmm. Still, it matters. It still matters because the Chinese military is really growing fast. And the problem of crisis management between China and the U.S. is that unlike the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union have a different sphere of influence and a fully demarcated buffer zone, there is no such thing in China and the U.S. because sometimes the U.S. ships would sail into the territorial sea of these islands and rocks. Okay. So for China, we take it as sovereignty issue. And on sovereignty issues, China cannot cave in. And if China is getting stronger, that means the danger of miscalculation actually is growing higher.
The Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, he was in an interview with the press, he was talking about we might be able to encounter crisis earlier than we thought. But of course, he also elaborated on the possibility that all sides work on the issue to avoid the crisis and conflict. How much do you think efforts will be taken to manage the situation, to avoid the crisis, or to so-called prevent it from happening before we knew it?
There are quite a few dimensions to what you have said. If we come to the position of some small countries like Singapore, actually their attitude toward China-U.S. competition is self-evident because being small countries, they definitely are worried. I myself have been to Singapore many times, and I have heard so many speeches by different senior officials from Singapore, because none of them surprised me, because their position can be predicted. And if we have confrontation, and the battlefield could be near the home, so that is why they are worried. But as I mentioned before, if we talk about how possible is a confrontation, then I would say this is the last thing that both militaries want. The point is there are no documents which have laid down clearly as to how many meters we should keep away from each other. For example, in the Qs, that is code for unplanned encounters, they have laid down a number of factors, not less than 7 factors, or if I remember correctly, it's about 7, or it is 9 conditions for keeping safe distance. For example, what about the speed? For example, what about visibility? All this could change the so-called seamanship. So, and above all this, there is another bigger issue. Another big issue is how do you look at the same thing in different lights? Then we definitely would have 12 nautical miles as territorial water and so on and so forth. But if Americans look at this issue, they just believe your islands are just artificial islands. And according to international law, they only need to keep a safe distance of 500 meters. So the difference between 500 meters and 12 nautical miles, you know yourself how big the difference and how difficult it is to keep the so-called safe distance.
All the devils, shall we say, are in the details, just as you illustrated. Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, yes. Center from the International Security and Strategy with Tsinghua University. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us and give us your latest assessment of the Anchorage meeting. Thank you.
Tian Wei.